4K, the buzzword of this generation of home consoles. Sony took a dive with their PlayStation 4 Pro, and now Microsoft is going even deeper with their recently announced Xbox One X. Lately, it's just been all about 4K and a little bit of HDR sprinkled in there, and all I can think about when I hear these numbers, letters, and acronyms is, what a waste of power. For those who've been living under a rock and don't know what 4K is, the format basically takes full HD and doubles the length and width of pixels. Instead of 1920 by 1080 pixels, it's 3840 by 2160 pixels. Instead of 1080p, it's 2160p. And by doubling the length and width of pixels, 4K is in effect pushing 4 times the total number of pixels than 1080p. You can literally cram 4 full HD displays worth of pixels into a 4K display. Another way to look at it is that for every pixel dot on 1080p, you get 4 in 2160p, so that's a lot more detail that can come across on screen. It's a sizable bump in resolution for sure, but that also means you need adequate hardware to handle all those pixels. And that's where the more expensive and more powerful PlayStation 4 Pro and Xbox One X hardware comes in. They aren't full-on next-gen consoles, but rather half-steps that allow games to run at higher resolutions. And look, all that power is nice and all, but I must say that it's rather disheartening to see all that power going into something as unnecessary as extra pixels. I don't know if it's just me, but the more I look at 4K, the more I realize just how little gain there is to it. Sure, it makes everything look a little bit sharper, and if you're up close and personal to your display, then you'll be able to notice some really fine details, but most people game in the living room from a distance anyway, and at the average distance that people play home consoles on their TV, you would be hard-pressed to notice any real difference between 1080p and 4K. After all, there's only so much pixel density that the human eye can discern from certain distances. So if you game very close to your TV, or if your TV is just freaking humongous, then yeah, 4K might make a difference and the extra sharpness is nice. But wouldn't you rather sacrifice some of that pixel count and a little bit of that sharpness if it means adding new graphical effects to games or just making frame rates consistently 60 frames per second? Keep in mind that since most of that extra hardware power on PlayStation 4 Pro and Xbox One X is being utilized just to push the additional quadruple pixels, there is little room for things like longer draw distances, enhanced lighting, additional NPCs and objects on screen at the same time, physics-based effects, and of course, smooth frame rate. All you're getting with 4K is just that extra layer of added sharpness, which again becomes irrelevant when you're like 10 feet away from your TV. From that point of view, I would much rather that the enhanced hardware of the PlayStation 4 Pro and Xbox One X be freed up for more tangible enhancements at 1080p resolution or even 2K, especially on the frame rates front. It honestly blows my mind a bit that 4K is a bigger buzzword and priority than 60 frames per second. Apparently, it's more important to make games look a little sharper than have them run, play, and feel butter smooth. And look, I'm all for 4K because there are certain games that can push 4K 60 FPS, and that's fantastic. I know that there are some games that offer the best of both worlds on both the PlayStation 4 Pro and Xbox One X. But it's not consistent. You've got games like Destiny 2, which is highly anticipated, coming out soon, but it's been confirmed to run at 4K 30 FPS on both PS4 Pro and Xbox One X. That's right, even on the Xbox One X, touted as the most powerful home console ever made, Destiny 2 apparently brings it to its knees, and it can only run at 4K 30 FPS. The PC version, on the other hand, runs at 60 frames per second if you have the appropriate hardware. And my question is, how the hell is 4K being prioritized over 60 frames per second gameplay, especially when we're talking about a AAA first-person shooter where smooth frame rate is paramount? I can't be the only one who would much rather reduce Destiny 2's resolution from 4K to 2K or 1080p even, if it means attaining that smooth 60 frames per second gameplay. At the very least, why not offer people the option to choose? Why not have a couple of presets that people can choose from, like 1080p 60 frames per second with additional effects, 2K 60 frames per second, and 4K 30 frames per second. And I know some games do it. If I recall, the PS4 exclusive Neo does this beautiful thing which offers options for people to choose a setting that emphasizes graphics or gameplay. One offers higher resolution at the cost of frame rate, and the other one offers higher frame rate at the cost of higher resolution. And it's this beautiful solution for everyone. So it shocks me that there are so many games still out there for these new consoles that don't offer these types of solutions, especially for a AAA first-person shooter title like Destiny 2, where smooth frame rate is far more important than pushing additional pixels. I don't get what's so wrong about making some compromises in pixel resolution to make gameplay just better. I've also been looking into other titles for PS4 Pro and Xbox One X that make use of their additional power. On the PS4 front, you've got numerous games that do run at 4K 60 FPS, which is fantastic, and a few that offer the option of 2K or 1080p 60 FPS based on what settings you choose, which is great. But it's still disheartening to see some of the more demanding first-party titles like Uncharted 4 still not offering a 60 frames per second option for single player, all because pushing resolution has become such a high priority in this generation of consoles. Uncharted 4 runs at 2K, but I'd much rather have 1080p if it means being able to hit that 60 frames per second benchmark on single player, or the game should at least offer the option to choose between one or the other. On the Xbox One X front, you've got games like Forza Motorsport 7 running at 4K 60 frames, which is awesome, but then you've got others like Anthem and Crackdown 3 that will only run at 30 frames per second. Again, we're talking about quote-unquote the most powerful home console ever made. And look, I don't want to give you the impression that I hate 4K or anything. 4K can be fantastic, especially when it's running on all cylinders, particularly on PC hardware. With PC, at least people have the option to choose what they prioritize. They can change the settings around to optimize frame rates or to optimize resolution. It's completely up to the player. When it comes to home consoles, games ship exactly the way they do as developers intended them. You can't fuck around with any of that. So I just hate the idea that when they ship these games, they're prioritizing 4K over 60 frames per second without giving players any choice. I thought that by 2017, 60 FPS would be standard. We have the hardware to do it, but console makers and game developers are instead opting to push for a number of pixels that we don't really need right now, and that, frankly, the world is not prepared for yet. I would even argue that the world isn't even interested in 4K. The transition from 1080p to 4K is far less noticeable than the transition from SD to HD. I found that aside from enthusiasts, most people just straight up cannot see the difference between full HD and 4K unless they're like right there up close and personal. For now, 1080p is simply put the perfect resolution for the average TV and monitor size when it comes to media consumption and gaming. I would say that 2K is a nice benchmark to hit with our current hardware. But 4K, I don't think we're quite there yet, and implementing this so early is coming at the sacrifice of improving graphics and smoothing out frame rate. Let me put it this way, I think 4K is a luxury, whereas 60 frames per second is a necessity. Honestly, if Microsoft came out during their E3 2017 press conference and said, Xbox One X, every game will offer 60 frames per second, we will guarantee it, then I would actually consider purchasing this console. That is honestly a valuable consumer proposition. On the other hand, I find no value in the constant emphasis on 4K, and with the lackluster selection of first-party titles, I still have zero interest in purchasing an Xbox One X. And you know what the saddest part about the emphasis of 4K over 60 FPS is? It's very telling of a video game industry that is more focused on graphics than gameplay and game polish. The Nintendo Switch only pushes, what, 720p and 1080p, but guess what? I've been perfectly content with the console because the games look fine and they play even better. Say what you want about Nintendo, but I feel like lately they've been proving more and more that you really don't need things like 4K to make some incredible titles. And what's funny is that a lot of Nintendo's first-party titles like Mario Kart 8, Splatoon 2, ARMS, they all run at 60 frames per second. Sure, more demanding games like Zelda Breath of the Wild run at 30 frames per second, and Switch games will never look as good as games on PS4 or Xbox One. But in return, at least Switch offers a unique benefit, the ability to take your games on the go. Where Switch lacks in power, it compensates with versatility and portability, and these are features that are far more compelling than I thought they would be. So there's actually a decent trade-off for the weaker hardware and the, at times, reduced frame rates. With 4K, on the other hand, it uses all that hardware power and at times lowers frame rates. For what exactly? A little bit of extra sharpness? It's just not a worthwhile trade, if you ask me. So my hope is that we can change the buzzword from 4K to 60 FPS. I genuinely believe that people will be more excited for PS4 Pro or Xbox One X if they emphasized frame rates over pixel count, if they placed the emphasis on a necessity over a luxury. The former is something that actually enhances gameplay, while the latter is just like this nice thing to have if you can afford it. It is my belief that every modern game should offer the option of 60 frames per second, even if it means reducing the resolution, especially when you've got powerful hardware like the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X. Games would look better and, more importantly, play better. I'm all for 4K, but give us some choice. Give us the option to define what we want from a game. Because if you ask me, there's just so much more value in 60 frames per second than 4K, and it sucks to see that priorities seem so backwards. It just feels like the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X have all this strength and power, but they aren't always being utilized for the right reasons. It just feels like a waste. So it is my hope that over time, 4K will kind of fade in the background, kind of like 3D, and they'll put the emphasis back into gameplay and important things like smooth 60 FPS. These are just my thoughts and opinions, though. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments below. Also, if you enjoy my content, consider supporting me on Patreon so we can remain independent from third-party sponsorship and corporate interference. And to be further updated on all things video game news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.